Well, Hugh Morgan, AC, sorry, correct that on the book, very welcome to have you here today. And in particular, I want to thank you for your contribution to the book on dignity and prosperity, the future of liberal Australia, which I know from your very distinguished business career and also involved in parts in the political scene, not as a formal member of parliament, but very active in public policy through your business association. I want to thank you for that contribution that you've made. All too often, I think we find nowadays senior business figures don't stand up and talk about the national interests, what's good for the long-term prosperity of Australia. They're much more interested in their own personal corporate interests or very short-term political fads. But before going on to talk about more broadly about where the business community is at, I'd like to start with your thoughts on your chapter, which is about national prosperity. What is it from your perspective, and you've been at the coalface of building and developing national prosperity in companies in Australia, but what do you see in the broader national sense drives our national prosperity?
Well, if you were to look just at the numbers, they're not very good, they're not helpful. If you looked at prosperity in terms of productivity is the driver, it's the outcome, if you like, it's the number that needs to be watched carefully. And the different segments are quite dramatic in their separation. So if you look at the last 20 years, the spectacular performance for this country is actually in agriculture. And it's sort of unheralded in the city centres. Yes. As if it doesn't exist, it's just become a mess maker. Followed by, of course, the mining sector, which has done well, not spectacular, well, I'd have to say. But unfortunately, as the nation has moved into basically a service sector, now occupying some 85% of employment, that segment has declined quite rapidly in productivity. It's the lead in the saddlebags for the nation, quite frankly, in terms of its performance for the last 20 years. Totally unrecognised. Increasing at a rapid rate. Government share of GDP continues to rise quite rapidly, and there's no representation anywhere to hold it back or to reverse that. So it's a challenge to the remaining part of the nation as to how do you manage these continuing high expectations against a falling productivity. That is a challenge.
That is a challenge, absolutely. And in the chapter, we explore a number of areas and where we've fallen off on productivity. We note the decline that means for living standards and where that might go in the future. Also for entrepreneurship, how there's been a declining share of new business startups. Small companies are a much smaller portion of the economy than they used to be. But the example we use, obviously, throughout the chapter is the mining sector, of which you have a deep background in. Mm-hmm. And you've seen a lot in your career, and some of the issues that we talked about in the chapter that you mentioned are things like industrial relations, green activism, ESG, for instance. How do you see those developments having impacted over the last 30, 40 years in the mining sector, given as well that we now know that mining is 8 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 of our biggest exporters. So we rely on mining to pay the bills as a nation.
That's a huge subject matter, quite frankly, because as you say, in terms of exports, it's really important. It's a single sector. By nature, it's got a high beta in terms of revenues, and that's the pricing of the product, with no pricing control, international competition all the time, based upon both domestic inputs and domestic attitudes. And the attitudes to the industry, quite frankly, have not improved well at all. I had cause recently to look at a public affairs program of 1979 at a time when I was then chairman of the Australian Mining Industries Council Public Affairs Committee. And I gave a speech subsequently identifying each of the features. You could produce that today. And I think, the industry may well be thinking about those sorts of things because it's under almost exactly the same tensions and issues then, today as it was then. So that, in a sense, suggests it's made little progress. If you look at the trust and distrust analysis that you see out of, let's say, the Roy Morgan polls, mining industry is third bottom. Whether it's the gambling or anything else, it's right at the bottom, near at the bottom. And you have those that are more in touch with everybody's daily needs and relationships and emotional relationships, like the retail industry. They are right at the top. So it's quite interesting. You have an industry which is very small in terms of employment numbers in the mining sector, remote from city centres, producing a lot of income, and vulnerable to assault in the intellectual challenge for people's attention to bring about change in political dynamics within a community. Not well equipped by background to handle that. Background is very much an engineering background. Move this mountain down that railway line, out that road at cost X. That's the overwhelmingly the focal point that has to take place in order to be competitive. Whereas if you're in the commercial centre, you understand everybody's daily needs instantly because it affects your daily sales in a community that's highly sensitive to change. So, in a sense, it's a natural disadvantage in terms of taking hold of communities, engagement with the communities. I think it's gross to say it's to educate them, because quite frankly, I don't think you can ever do that. It's just too small a number of people to say, you've all got to get on board with us. Because the last 30 years has shown me very clearly, what am I talking about here now? 40 years, there's been no change, despite huge effort to do so from time to time. So, you asked what's the nature of the challenge. I'd say it's significant. Significant because of its remoteness, significant because of the ESG challenge, significant because of the income that it generates, and therefore the assumption that it's available to take into the community, not understanding the variability about it or the international competitiveness of it.
The mining sector, as we know, is not only our major exporter, it's one of the highest paying industry sectors in terms of average wages. It obviously contributes an enormous amount of infrastructure, particularly to regional and remote Australia, which, as you said, probably is not noticed in the cities, which is where most people live, but it does a lot of that. It's also produced our richest individuals and our biggest companies. And yet, as you say, it's held in rather low esteem, despite all it does for the nation. And I wonder, the only time we sort of see the mining industry get agitated and become very public is when it's under very specific direct assault. The mining tax, for example, it suddenly rallied, put a lot of money on the table to stop the mining tax. Now we see with the current assault on subcontractors and the use of flexible labour arrangements, labour hire, suddenly the mining industry, with some other business sectors that are affected, has decided, no, we need to stand up and put a position contrary to what the government's trying to do because it will be so. Do you think that taking a much more narrow focus, specific interest approach to national affairs, which is those examples would apply, is perhaps not the right approach, and a much broader national interest approach over a longer term to try to engage on longer term policy thinking, planning, strategizing for the country and the benefits that we have would be a more effective way? Or how do you think you can address those two?
Well, what you lay out might be an interesting proposition, but you've got to look at the dynamics of each individual company. They are both major national entities, but they're also major individual competitive enterprises. Mm-hmm. I stress the word competitive enterprises. They're competitive for labour at all levels, skilled labour, all sorts of labour. They're competitive about product outputs. They're competitive for locations, for attention, and a great variability in terms of size. So you have small startups you're not going to get anything smaller than grub staking some explorer, all the way through to the very large companies and the multi-billion dollar companies. And yet they are, in many cases, tarred with the same brush when it goes wrong, because it's a segment rather than just a company. Mm-hmm. When something happens. So there's this, I revert back to an earlier comment, they are enterprises that are not fundamentally diverting major resources, to might say, relationships with the community, as if you were in retail, advertising all sorts of products, getting everybody to understand everything that you're doing. It's hard to say, look, I got a ton of zinc here and it's really sexy and it's wonderful and don't you like it, etc. No. So the task is hard. The emotional generation within a company is different from the bulk of the community, and they're competitive with each other. So if there's something comes up like a difference to the taxation regime, that actually brings them all together to overcome some of these individual competitive enterprises where the funding that's required to be diverted from existing activities to this, what Hope calls a temporary position, is agreeable. In the normal circumstance, it's not agreeable within the corporation. Whereas in, let's say, a retail company, it's agreeable every day because that is your business. Okay. So this means in terms of the capability, the corporate and managerial capability that you're talking about is very difficult to overcome. And it's international. I'm not just talking about an Australian context. This is something that travels with the industry in any jurisdiction.
Yes. Well, and I accept that's the case, although the mining industry seems to have slightly better national significance in other countries where it is held in much higher esteem and recognised, I guess, for its contribution to the nation's wealth and prosperity, perhaps more so than we do in Australia. But I wonder then if, in a broader public sense, it can't overcome its image problems, deficiency, that if you like, because it for whatever reasons it can't unite to do that, or it doesn't see that as a priority. Surely, though, in the corridors of power, so amongst the public policy decision makers, there must be something that could be done to educate them on the importance. If you delay a project for 15 years, like Olympic Dam expansion, the consequences of that are far-reaching and significant, and therefore it surprises me, I guess, that those who are in the position to influence these outcomes at a public policy level don't have a much greater appreciation and thanks, to be honest, for what the industry does contribute to the nation.
Well, I think I put on another hat and say, if I was to read the the group, the population you're talking about, I'm not sure that they are adverse to the current circumstances that the mining industry's faced. I mean, with the development of Olympic Dam, which you know what it is, I mean, I dealt with 52 government departments. That was 1982. I didn't know there were 52 departments, quite frankly, at that time. Each one might be very helpful collectively. You know, it was a task. Now, that was before, you know, we had a number of NGOs who were very adverse to the project. We had obviously great, you know, approvals and all this to go through, but they were 100-fold more today. And that's obviously reflective of the population, what they need. But they're different from each other. So the sector of the mining industry is not something you can put just because it's mining. The coal industry had very different agendas from, let's say, the metalliferous industry. The gold mining industry was different from the uranium debate was an entirely different for the rest of the industry. The industry wanted to separate itself from them.
Yes.
Didn't want to be tarred with the difficulties of them. So these tensions, I don't think there's any escape from them, quite frankly. They just have to be managed.
Do you think that on the current trajectory, though, there is a risk, and there's a quote you use from Sir R.V. Parbo, the late Sir R.V. Parbo, some time ago actually, where he said he was fearful that there were no new mines coming on stream, and therefore eventually the existing ones will run out and then there will be nothing left. Do you think that we are at risk of that happening, literally not bringing on enough for the future, that the mining industry will wither, if not die out, but will wither and become less and less significant to the nation, and therefore our prosperity that depends on it will be at risk?
Well, there's certainly an element of that. You know, in terms of, one could well put forward the argument that there's in fact no limitation on resources, and all of those limitations that are there are actually man-made. You know, it's reservations of areas where you can't go to. It's the time it takes to get approvals, and therefore the cost to get something done goes up. Those sorts of limitations do impact quite dramatically. On the other hand, the technology that's been applied for in the industry has been actually quite remarkable. So as you are able to recover more from less, in other words, if the grade of a particular element as it declines, if you are able to recover that, then you get an exponential increase in the possible reserves that can be turned from a mineralization to a resource. So, you know, when I started in the mining industry, a big truck was, I don't know, 35 tons. Now a big truck is 400 tons. So in terms of what you are moving, the material that can be moved, and the grade of the material that can yet be economic has changed dramatically over that, let's say, 50 years. So that actually increases the resources that can be accessed. And I think you'll find that new technology accessing very minor particles within existing resources, nanotechnology extraction, etc. We will see that. We saw it in things like flotation as a part of a metallurgical process, had a big impact on what it is that could be produced. So whilst on a time slot, an immediate look at current circumstances, what Avi said is fair enough, you know, it's correct. What I think he's referring to is that public attitudes might be such that unknowingly they will turn off a tap without recognising that actually it's supplying a lot of the standard of living which they're presently enjoying.
Well, we know that the Greens want us to stop coal altogether, all hydrocarbons eventually to be eliminated. So that would be a pretty significant effect on the economy as well.
I think I've just touched on something. I think that's, that's a very relevant point to us, because the irony that one must observe at present is the enthusiasm to embark upon that project, on that process right now, and the time span that politically is being imposed on us to bring that change about, quite frankly, can't be achieved, primarily because the same elements and the same people have actually stopped the supply chain of alternatives to come forward. Mm-hmm. And in effect, what we've done is, if you were to look, let's say, just at the oil, something like that, we rely very much on what comes out of the Middle East. If we were to change and look at where are we drawing upon, or where does the world draw its resources for solar panels and windmills, etc., it's much more intense out of China. So what we are basically doing is taking ourselves out of the hands of the Middle East sheiks and putting ourselves into the hands of the CCP. And
I'm not sure that's a better move, but
well, that's what we're doing. I mean, the point, what it is, because who controls it?
Yeah.
And if we are busily destroying, if you like, our fossil fuel regular energy supply processes, whether it's oil, gas, or energy from coal, we're actually substituting it something where the supply chain is entirely in the hands of the CCP. Is that a good trade-off? I find that rather strange, quite frankly.
I do too, yes. We're giving up our energy security and our national security, putting it peril as well. So
I've no doubt it's being watched.
Does not make any sense at all.
I think Beijing would be watching it.
Yeah. Quickly, nuclear power, nuclear energy. Obviously, we have amongst the world's greatest deposits of uranium and are a uranium exporter. What's your view of what we should be doing on nuclear?
Well, I'm a supporter of the civil nuclear program, obviously, having spent a lifetime in it. But don't get too excited about it. Firstly, in terms of the uranium resources, is a tiny part of the end cost of producing electricity from civil nuclear power. It's about 6%. So just because we've got buckets of uranium doesn't mean that because you've got it, you're going to actually enhance yourself a great deal, because it's a minor part of the output. The major part of the output is capital. The capital cost of these programs, even the smart reactors, capital cost is the primary thing. And our performance in capital management in this country is amongst the worst of the OECD. So quite frankly, if the political process was that the civil nuclear program was permitted by all political parties with great enthusiasm, I'm not sure a great deal would happen in a hurry. In terms of the traditional civil nuclear power programs, nobody is going to finance, in my opinion, the major traditional civil nuclear power construction here. They are not going to put their money in the hands of the CMFEU. And if you have a look at the capital intensity of even the current programs in the UK, in Finland, etc., nobody's going to finance it here at all, period. With small nuclear issues, I think there is a role for that, and we should be engaged in that. But the lead time for accessing that right now is, I think, much further forward than people are thinking about. There's about the first of those demonstration plants are being built now. So you've got at least another 5 or 6 years lead time So you then got to join the queue of the countries that are already with those companies, assisting them, so they're at the front end of the queue. My recollection is that, for example, Rolls-Royce in the UK has an agreement with the UK government for 6 but small nuclear reactors, but their ambition is to actually produce 30. So if you wanted to access Rolls-Royce, come back next century, quite frankly. I mean, we're too late. We're always late on the game. Other countries have actually got their technicians in those companies working and contributing, and therefore they are at the front end of the queue of what they might want to get from those enterprises. And these plants have an approval process that's a bit like approving new aircraft. It costs about $600 to $800 million just to get the approval process of a design, just like it does for a new aeroplane. So it's not like going down the street and buying a new can opener or something. These things have got a long lead time to them.
So then we better manage our energy transition carefully, because we may not have any sustainable power for the near future if we keep closing things without anything coming on stream to replace them.
Yeah, I'd say we're not doing it well.
No. You mentioned we're not very good at managing capital projects, and I think that's pretty clear. We're not very good at building things cheaply in Australia, would be maybe another way of putting it.
Well, there's a great deal of overrun. There are some projects that have been well done, right? But we've got a long tail of poor performances as well.
Yeah. So if you think you've been involved with the Business Council, as a former president of the Business Council, the Peak Business Group in Australia, you're involved very much when it was key part of the national reform agenda. So you were a very public advocate of IR reform, fiscal reform, taxation reform, regulatory reform, opening up our trade barriers, things to make us a more competitive economy in an open world environment. And I wonder, therefore, if we go beyond mining, though, and think about, from a public policy perspective, from what you've seen over a distinguished period of time, what do you think are the current public policy challenges that the government should be addressing? And if this government doesn't address it, that maybe the Liberal led opposition should be focusing on as its priorities for the future?
That's a big brief. Let's go with it.
Well, you can just pick a few that you think are the top 3 that you'd like to really look at.
The community is very different from what it was even 30 years ago. Right? Both the business community, the forthcoming younger voters, etc. Quite clearly, we're seeing a division in the communities that I think more so than we've seen in the past. And there's a response to that. So any comment that I would make would have to take into account those changes. And I think that has to be, if you're comparing different periods, that extends to responses within all segments of the community, including business. I mean, it's always been difficult for senior people in business to get themselves out on a limb and still survive, quite frankly. So Foxhole Corporation's a lot safer than it is actually, putting a hand up and being mainstream media fodder. So I'm not trying to be too much an excuse, but it really then is a function of the strength of business associations, and they go through their phases as well. Right now, I think we're seeing a change from, let's say, 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, 5 to 10 years ago, it was quieter than it is now. Now we're seeing a new age requirement, if you like, an ESG pressure to get engaged with social engagements, questioning what's the role of the corporation in terms of community commitments, what does it take into account, etc. So corporations are now being faced with new challenges. and it depends on that the leadership is where does it seek to find itself within those new challenges, quite frankly. What has the nation got to do? I mean, a lot is all I'd have to say, quite frankly. I think that political leadership is weak. Political parties are weak. Many of our institutions are weak. And I say those institutions, universities, in terms of really understanding just how nasty the world can be. I'll come to grips to it.
Mm-hmm.
We've lived in a very, the community's been well dressed for a significant period of time, and one must take into account there's an outcome from that, and maybe this is the outcome that comes from it. But when you look at issues like, for example, productivity, we know that it's got a hangover being productivity equals unemployment. Seems to be the mantra that has come from the past. But our productivity is awful. I've talked that to start with.
Yes.
If you don't get that right, you've got a problem. It's not being addressed in the way that I think that it needs to be addressed in a competitive sense. I think the community understands that nations are in competition with each other. It's got nothing to do with the political banner that they're in. They are in competition with each other. It's a competition from which there's no escape, and it's a competition from which there is no end.
Absolutely.
So this sort of understanding of competition, we understand well in this community in the sporting endeavours. The screaming at the umpire, or the get rid of the coach, or get rid of this, is an expression of ultimate representation of competition. They come out of the grandstand, and today most people have got their hand out wanting something from the government. It's amazing, this dichotomy of not understanding that your whole nation is as if you are inside that, say, all the time. And so everything we do outside that stadium is reflective on a larger scale of where the nation sits. And it's only if you have that continuing sense of competition that you really get some improved outputs that you see with countries that see the tensions of competition stroke insecurity. And you see countries like Singapore, and you see, and you see where Japan came from. You can see countries that are without resources, understanding as it's in their DNA a sense of insecurity. They have to perform. Yes. We don't have that in our DNA because we've been resource rich on food, on minerals, on opportunity, on space, on everything that you want to put together as a plus, we've had in abundance. So it's very hard for a community to have that sense of competition, to have a security that comes from it. Because unless a country is financially sound, it's weak. That's the outcome, because weak countries, financially weak countries, don't survive. They are challenged.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the comments I make in the book is, if you're economically strong, you'll be financially strong, then you will be militarily, national security strong.
Correct.
If you lack the first two, you'll never be able to manage the third. You'll always be at the behest of a much more powerful, successful nation.
Absolutely.
And to your point, John Howard used to say, it is a competition, it's a race, and
Yep.
it never stops.
Correct.
As soon as you stop, somebody else is going to come on past you. And in your chapter, you actually mention the relative standings of Australia, and I think we hit about we're in the top 4 or 5 by most international indicators around the year 2000, which was pretty good. We'd moved up through the various reforms of the 80s and the 90s. We'd moved up from a pretty also-ran around the mid-teens or early teens to one of the top in the world, as you said, countries like the Singapores were still there, the United States, which is a very flexible, competitive nation, open nation. But now we've really dropped. Progressively, we've just slipped further and further, and now we barely get into the top 20 by some indicators, sure, which is pretty poor. It means we're not only relative to the size of our economy behind, we're actually behind the relativity, sure, of our economy. Yeah. And as you mentioned, and I think it's certainly true, having worked around the world for different countries and advising on competitiveness and looking at what makes for successful countries and successful nations and prosperous societies, if we continue to slip, competitiveness is a key driver of future productivity, mm-hmm, and future productivity is a key driver clearly of future living standards. Mm-hmm. And I therefore wonder, when you see these things, are you concerned that in fact our way of life is potentially at threat if we continue on this lazy path of just letting ourselves continuing to slip and slip and slip, and then eventually it gets to a point where it becomes too hard to turn back? Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the danger you've seen in the educational standings, if you like, of our secondary education, reading standards, arithmetic, all these things. It's there in front of us. It doesn't matter how much money seems to be thrown at it. Something is not right. I don't know whether it's the parents, teachers, funding, whatever the talent base is. We quite clearly have been slipping. I mean, if you went through an individual, took that as an individual reference form or as a performance of a company form, it's going backwards. So that's the future. That's the future talent you're bringing forward. And I think it's, to your point, it's a matter of concern.
What would be your advice to the leaders of today or tomorrow as to what they should be focused on to reverse this if we are to return to being one of the leading nations in the world?
That I'd need to think about that. I mean, that's a big question, you say. It's because you're talking about people's individual responses on a mass basis. A lot of people get angry about where they see themselves, those that want to bring about social change. I mean, we have to recognise that from, I think, a perspective, certainly from where I come from, obviously from a conservative basis, I've got to give credit to those of the left of society who I see have invested the last at least 40 to 60 years with great energy, with objectives in mind, to bring about, from their point of view, substantial change. And they've created those conditions and brought about change, not from my perspective, I'll be very personal about it, that I think's in our national interest. I'm sure they might think it might be in their national interest or in their whatever they want to achieve, but I don't. That same energy is not being matched on the other side. So we have to recognise that if you wish to preserve, or if I wanted to see a preservation of some of the best part of, I think, our past, I've got to recognise there is also an absence of the same level of energy and endeavour as I see on those who are wanting to bring about a change. And so that recognition, I think, is fair enough, has to be recognised.
So we need a reinvigoration and renewal of liberalism to counter this.
Absolutely. I mean, but are we good at? Are we talking to ourselves? How do you sell it? How do the institutions that represent conservatism, how well are they performing? What are their vulnerabilities because they're being identified? So you're letting yourself down, if you like, as well. All those things have to be recognised, the weaknesses, rather than just selling the upsides the whole time to make them better.
Well, thank you very much, Hugh Morgan, for your time today, and I very much appreciated discussing with you, and I hope we can have a more positive response at some point by our political leaders with some ideas to turn this around. So thank you very much.
Okay. Fine.